Did you make it up to kids?
No.
I see. I wonder if something we did.
I think they probably got it.
So you're going to monitor it from the office and come back to the East Coast.
This is you did
Good luck with it.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to. Yeah, it's I didn't
Oh, hi.
You got the whole crew here.
Maybe get some
If you want some color, I brought. It won't run me.
No. I did. Masters.
So we'll give people a few more minutes to arrive and settle in as they're coming in from their workplaces, but I see several new faces, so welcome those of you who haven't attended our UNBC Northwest public presentation series in the past. If you'd like to be put on the mailing list for regular reminders as to our bi-weekly lectures, please see Alma or email info-northwest, I guess it is, at unbc.ca and get on that mailing list. You could also pick up a copy of our presentation series on the brochure table as you go out the door. 2 weeks from now, for example, we'll be having Kelsey Weeb, the curator of the Terrace Heritage Park Museum, talking about her research into the history of the Lake Elves Hot Springs. So that's next on the agenda 2 weeks from now. Today we're pleased to have Rosalind Barabash talking about reconciliation and relationship between Indigenous and settler communities. This is going to be reporting on some of her master's research. Roz was born on the Sunshine Coast, went to university at McGill, where I believe she specialized in geography, and then did her master's at the University of Victoria. She's been living in the Terrace area for the last 3 years or so, raising a family and getting involved in community activities. So with that as a bit of a background, I'm going to turn it over to Roz.
Okay. Hi, you guys. This and this. Make sure this is happening. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your day to come to the public presentation. I brought coloring stuff in case anyone gets bored. Usually I've got 2 kids, so I never go anywhere without crafts and snacks. But there's no kids here today, so I don't know, maybe you can find the child in you and grab the washable markers. So today I'm going to be talking about decolonization, reconciliation, and the role of the settler. I want to thank Phil for inviting me here to do this presentation, and also all the other people at UNBC who work to bring these public presentations to you. It's a pretty unique and awesome thing that we have this university in our town, and it's just a great way to have knowledge share. And also, we have this going out on a live stream. So I've always wanted to be on TV. So we're live streaming. I posted it on Facebook that I was going to be doing this, and then I really regretted it when all my friends were like, "Oh, I'm going to do that. I'm going to start live streaming." And then I thought, "Oh, bummer! Like now I'm embarrassed." And it's like it's also going to be archived too. So yeah, that's a little scary, but whatever. So I've got 3 parts to my discussion today. The first is I'm just going to do a bit of introduction and give you some definitions. And I'm going to talk about my story and how I came into this type of work. Then I'm going to move on to talk about the Sechelt Truth-Telling Initiative. And this is going to be used as an example of a decolonization process and an attempt at reconciliation. And I'm also going to use it as an example of the role of the settler. So then lastly, I'm going to offer some insights that I've gathered from doing this work. And I say the word insights because I'm not like an expert on this. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert. It would be kind of inappropriate if I was to say that. But I have put a lot of thought into this and a lot of care into this work. And I feel compelled to share it with those who want to listen. So I'm going to offer insights, not conclusions, because I don't really think this work ever concludes. It never really wraps up in a tight little package that you can say, "Oh, look at that. I've arrived." So just insights that I wanted to give you guys today. So also I'm going to be reading off some notes because it's a lot of information and I kind of tried to memorize it and do it more fluidly, but like I say, I've had like 2 babies in the past 3 years and my brain doesn't really work the way it used to. So I'm going to, it's kind of my cop-out, I'm going to be reading off these notes, and but at the end of the discussion I'll throw the notes aside and I can answer any of your questions. I made sure that I left ample time to answer questions because I'd like to have more fluid, dynamic discussion about it after, but I want to make sure that I get through everything. So, I'm kind of beginning the talk with an assumption because if I was to just kind of dive into this without starting with this assumption that everyone in this room understands that Canada has an unsavory colonial past. Because while there are examples of some individuals acting in accordance with Indigenous values and ways of life at the time of colonization, the overall attitudes and actions of European settlers and the political and legal institutions that they were creating was rooted in cultural chauvinism. And this chauvinism is still around today. So if we didn't assume that this was true, I could talk for an hour. I could, there's people who have written extensively about this. That could take up the whole conversation. So I'm just going to assume that we're all on the same page and that we all agree upon that. And if there's questions about that later, we can touch on those. So I also wanted to give some definitions. The first definition is of colonization, the act of setting up a colony away from one's place of origin. But of course that's a really benign definition. Actually the process of colonization that has occurred all over the world is actually characterized by violence, and it can involve cultural genocide or flat out genocide. Colonization involves land theft, usually, and trickery in treaty making, and the development of a system that is aimed at assimilating natives to deal with the Indian problem. So decolonization is another definition I wanted to give. It's one of those words that you can't really just give a one sentence definition. It's a process that's actually done at like the personal, familial, community, or national level. And you could say that it is rooted in an Indigenous framework and it's working towards self-determination, whether it's political self-determination, like forming separate nations, or maybe personal expression of self-determination. So those are some of the definitions. I wanted to offer a few more here. IRSS is the Indian Residential School System, and I'm also kind of assuming that we all have heard about residential schools. These schools were erected for social and political reasons, namely to aid in state building, and they aimed to eradicate Indigenous people through a process of assimilation. And we've all heard of the horrible stories of abuse that took place in these schools. So I'm going to be talking a lot about Indian residential schools during the rest of the presentation. So there's also this word emancipatory, which seems like a really big, scary word, but it really just means research that seeks to empower the subjects, and it criticizes traditional research practices for objectifying the participants. So the research project that I'm going to be talking about aimed to be emancipatory research. And the last definition I wanted to give, just to set the stage, is truth-telling. So truth-telling is a process that aims to shed light on a history, and in doing so reveals an ignored or erroneous one. So those are some definitions. I also realized that when I was preparing this today, I wanted to give the definition of, just talk about reconciliation. So reconciliation is a process of making amends for historical injustices and taking action to live in a just way. So reconciliation work is being done by church groups, by government, and by special interest groups. So we're going to be talking about that. I kind of forgot that definition. So with that, we can move on. So basically, I wanted to give a bit of a backstory, like my own personal story, which is the personal process of coming into this work. I am of Western European descent, and my family came here 4 generations ago. They settled in the Vancouver area and on the East Coast in Nova Scotia. I grew up on Sechelt Nation territory before moving to Montreal to complete an undergraduate degree. So it was at McGill where I started to question Canada's relationship with the original inhabitants of this land. And when I grew up in Sechelt, I had a lot of Sechelt Nation friends, and I learned Sechelt language in the public school there. And I was always taught within my family to have the utmost respect for Indigenous cultures. But I later discovered that I was obviously blind to, or perhaps not politicizing at a very young age, the nuances of the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So, especially in the place in Sechelt where I grew up. So it was at McGill where I really awoke to the racist and problematic assumptions that were being made about Indigenous peoples and cultures. And these assumptions were being made by my peers, people that I associated with, and sometimes would even call my friends. So I found myself becoming really enraged in class or in social gatherings when a racist joke was being told, or a perspective was being shared regarding Canada's history that I felt was ignorant or misinformed. And while some people that I was speaking with, they truly didn't know the history of the Indian residential schools system and of Canada's colonial past, I often found that the ignorance was either at times would be willful or just kind of convenient. I found that people ignored or justified the acts of our forefathers, and we've all heard the kind of, oh, that happened so long ago, why don't those natives just move on and get over it and keep going? And that was the specific attitude that really infuriated me. And so it was at that point in my 20s that I basically wanted to develop a more effective strategy to address the ignorance that I was facing amongst my peers. So I had a few motivations to act, and these motivations were I actually developed with some friends in the program that I did my master's degree work. It was the Indigenous Governance program. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But I worked with a friend, Julie Jensen, and Robin Heslip, who's doing her PhD in this type of work, and we developed these motivations. But so basically, during the process, I started reading Diage Alfred's and Paulette Reagan's work. I'll show you a picture of their books if you're interested in picking them up. And I also started reading different philosophers like Paulo Freire and Albert Memmi. And I began confronting my own personal discomfort around being a settler on this land and bearing the face of the colonizer or the oppressor. I recognized that I wanted to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people. And basically my motivation for this was threefold. So the first motivation was that Canada claims to be a fair and just country, but the historic and current actions of the government are not reflecting this. And there exists a huge amount of ignorance regarding Indigenous cultures. So I found this convenient distancing from our colonial history extremely bothersome and also really dangerous. I felt compelled to confront this attitude. But then my second motivation to act wasn't completely altruistic. I wasn't interested in basically helping Indigenous people as if they couldn't help themselves, and I didn't want to be paternalistic in my actions. But instead I wanted to be useful to a cause that I felt was actually threatening my own freedom. Because as a settler, I acknowledge that my privilege is derived from a colonial relationship, and I felt responsible for taking actions that would confront this privilege and the colonial institutions that continue to create it and maintain it. So I was interested in establishing basically respectful ways of being and relating to this place. And I recognize that I actually bear the face of the oppressor and of the colonizer. And that my freedom and my ability to live in a good way is being threatened by the actions of the past and by the actions of people and institutions who are acting today that I feel I don't really have control over. So I felt a need for freedom from this ingrained oppressor-oppressed relationship that Albert Memmi speaks about in his book, The Colonizer and the Colonized. So, because both of the oppressor and the oppressed are dehumanized through these dynamics and roles and preconceived notions about one another. And I wanted to work to address these dynamics and their destructive effects. So my third motivation to act was that the founders and the masterminds of the residential school system are long gone, I still feel responsible to address and learn from this history. And Paulette Reagan talks about this in her book, Unsettling the Settler Within, and I'll show a slide of that after. Because basically, we can't change the past, but I think we really have a responsibility to learn from it, and we need to bear witness to the atrocities of colonization, especially when Indigenous peoples are still suffering discrimination and prejudice and racism. So, furthermore, while I'm not responsible for the act of the Indian residential school system and the act of colonization, I still feel that I benefit from it. And this is always I sometimes find myself having a hard time explaining why this is, but I guess I can just offer an example. I just bought a house here in Terrace on unceded territory, and the only way that I could live here and I could go fish in the river and I could take my kids to ski at Shames Mountain and I can, live in this beautiful place is because it was stolen. So sometimes I have a hard time explaining that to people, and people don't really understand how we're still benefiting from it. But to me it seems really clear, and I guess we could have a discussion about that after. So that was a lot of information, but we'll keep going along. From my motivations, I've defined my motivations, but then there's kind of this huge step in between acknowledging and understanding them, and understanding my desire for solidarity work, but then determining what the actions should be. I think some people don't really act on these issues because they don't know what actions to take, or they're maybe scared to take a wrong action. And this is a really key point. This was defined by alongside my friends at IGov that I did my master's work with, because it's hard to know what's right sometimes and what truly is decolonizing. We want to ensure that our actions are really confronting and not reinforcing the colonial attitudes and structures that we're seeking to evade. So sometimes we're so steeped in our own culture and beliefs that we miss something or we act in an inappropriate way when we're actually just trying to do good. I could say something today in this presentation that's extremely inappropriate or offensive to a First Nations person, and I might have no idea that I've done that, and I've definitely done that before doing this work. But all I can say is that it's kind of tricky, and it's a very complicated dynamic. And for me, the place that I had to start was with education. So my educational path took the form of completing a master's degree in Indigenous governance at UVic. And the program focused on traditional structures and ways of governance through encompassing the values and perspectives, concepts, and principles of Indigenous political cultures. So the project that I'm about to discuss was the community governance project that was a requirement for the completion of this degree, but the project kind of took on its own life and grew beyond an academic requirement into something much more personal and meaningful. So with that, we'll move on to the second part of the presentation today, which is on the Sechelt Truth-Telling Initiative. And there we go. This is just a picture of the Sechelt waterfront, and that's the Shishala emblem, that the double-headed sea serpent that's on a lot of the Sechelt, like it's on the Longhouse and all over town. So basically the aim of this project was to bring to light the impacts of the Indian residential school system in the town of Sechelt. Our goal was to share the history of how residential schools on the Sunshine Coast impacted the community. Our goal was to, we wanted to gain basically a further understanding of why Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations in Sechelt were characterized by mistrust. Because upon returning to Sechelt, I began to notice that the rosy picture that I had painted in my mind of Indigenous settler relations was actually not entirely accurate. And there existed a division in the community of Sechelt between the Native and non-Native factions. So basically the division was best described as an invisible wall. And the project wanted to discuss the existence and the purpose of this invisible wall. We wanted to identify directions people could take to generate a movement of education, reflection, and subsequent action. And I should point out that we weren't trying to take down this invisible wall. We didn't think that, we knew that it served a purpose, and we weren't all just trying to come together and be happy and sing songs. It wasn't like that. It was just, we really wanted to open a dialogue. We didn't think that we could just wipe away all wrongdoings and stuff. We just wanted to have it basically open a dialogue between the two communities. So to situate this work on a national level, it's safe to say that we are in the era of truth-telling, as demonstrated by Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the 2010 Stephen Harper apology. And there's also been other apologies from different churches, different church groups. And so, however, it was important for the purpose of this project to draw a distinction between how reconciliation had been defined by the Canadian government and by mainstream society, and what we actually saw as reconciliation. In Paulette Reagan's book, in the foreword of that book, Diage Alfred writes a piece that's pretty impactful, and he says that basically there's a growing understanding that Indigenous people accept payments and apologies for crimes associated with residential schools or jobs or contracts for stolen land. And he thinks that this is to say that material compensation can address the crimes of colonization. And both Paulette's book and our project demanded that we dig a little bit deeper and get to the heart of what constitutes meaningful reconciliation and ethical apologies. So our definition of reconciliation put a really big emphasis on truth-telling and drew notions of justice and restitution from the Sechelt community on the Sechelt Nation's community terms. So, and this was happening through a process of education and dialogue. It was very place-based and very personal. The 2010 Harper government apologized for its role in the Indian residential school systems. And a lot of First Nations people, it was a very emotional time, and a lot of First Nations people accepted this apology, but a lot of First Nations people didn't. And I personally problematized it a bit. I didn't want to have that apology just be the end of the discussion. And I don't think it was meant to be the end of the discussion, but I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper and get into that apology, because at the time it was basically questioned whether the apology was the beginning of a new relationship or just a symbolic gesture needing supportive action. So since that time, since 2010, we've of course seen a lot of bills and some big bills and some policies and many actions taken by the Harper government that do suggest that the apology was actually not the beginning of a renewed relationship. I mean, this could be debated, but it's kind of funny, like in our house we have a phrase, the Harper apology, because my 2-year-old son is like really excellent at the Harper apology. He'll drag his little brother into the bathroom and try to flush him down the toilet or something. And then, I'll say, Fisher, apologize to your brother. It's like, you can't do that. You have to be nice. You have to be fair. This is wrong. And he's like, does this smarmy, like, I'm sorry. And it's really like, it's not a heartfelt apology. So that's called the Harper apology in our house. So our project, there's also the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is was a national effort to basically shed light on the Indian residential school system. And I don't want to say that that's a bad initiative or anything, but our project just wanted to do things a little bit differently, because we were really, basically some people that were doing, that were participants in our project felt that working at that national level with the National Commission was just a little bit too removed. And they did do community events, like in cities. They held a lot of events where people could give testimony, and they had like knowledge sharing and all this stuff. But basically, we were, as opposed to like working at the national level for our project, we wanted to work at the local level and situate this work within our community. So I'll just continue along here. That's Wesley Jeffries. He was the main, the guy that did everything for this project. He's an incredible, knowledgeable Sechelt Nation leader. And I don't know if he's listening on the live stream, but I hope he watches this someday. So the field component of this project commenced in May of 2011 in Sechelt, when I attended one of Wesley's cross-cultural awareness workshops that he holds at the Longhouse. So he, like I said, he later became a supervisor for this project, and the way the project worked was basically he became like a faculty member of UVic, so he oversaw the project. So at the event, I began speaking with Wesley, and we both determined that we had a mutual interest in undertaking decolonization work on the Sunshine Coast. From this point on, I became actively involved in meeting with various community groups on the Sunshine Coast, attending workshop and circles, and meeting one-on-one with individuals. In the early stages, the details of this project had very little definition, but all of the events that I was taking part in centered around relationship building and the need for truth-telling. So at the May Cross Cultural Awareness Workshop, after the workshop, I met with Wesley regularly, and we started to develop a relationship of understanding and of mutual trust. And this was a slow process. It wasn't just something that happens overnight, but we kind of developed an unlikely friendship that bridged like cultural and generational and also gender divides. And when Wesley and I were discussing more of the details of the project, he told me that the Sechelt Nation had a real lack of trust with outside researchers. And this is something that happens a lot in First Nations culture, and it's like completely understandable given the history of poor research being done in Indigenous communities. So even though I grew up in Sechelt and I grew up with the Sechelt Nation children and all of that, I'm still obviously very much an outsider. So if a project was to take place in the town, involving both the Sechelt Nation members and non-Sechelt Nation members, it would really have to be developed in a very particular way. So this is a book that guided a lot of my understanding of how to conduct research in First Nations communities, and it's called, I don't know if you can read it, it's Decolonizing Methodologies, and it's by Linda Tuai Smith. Can't pronounce her middle name there, but you can get it on the slide, and I can go back to the slide if you guys wanted to remember that book, because it's really good. So the research project aimed to counter the colonial legacy of harmful research practices by rooting the methodological framework in emancipatory, that's that word again, community-based perspectives that were inclusive of Sechelt Nation ways of doing, thinking, and being. So we weren't really interested in just doing a research project for the sake of adding to our own personal knowledge bank. We wanted our project to actually grow legs and contribute to positive change in our communities. And this project aimed to serve a decolonizing agenda in that we called into question the legitimacy of non-Indigenous claims to land, while aiming to make space for a resurgence of Sechelt culture and health as a nation. So we were also developing this process from the community level, and we kind of saw that as an act of decolonization, because we were devolving power away from the state to name and to shape and name the process for ourselves. So to ensure that this project was remaining true to emancipatory community-based research, I met regularly with Wesley to define the scope of the project and to discuss appropriate ways to conduct research within the community. I also spoke informally with Sechelt Nation other community contacts to update them on the progress and direction of the project, and I was really always trying to just seek advice and guidance. So this is a picture of St. Augustine's residential school in Sechelt. So from all of this, we basically decided that we needed to start, well, actually from the basics, and we recognized that there was a complete lack of knowledge in Sechelt around the history of colonization, especially with regards to land theft and residential schools. So over time, the aim of the project was further crystallized, and it honed in on the need to share the history of residential schools specifically. This is the first thing we wanted to shed light on. So we felt that until the effects of residential school was broadly understood, we couldn't even approach an honest conversation about reconciliation and relationship building. So we wanted to use the project as an educational tool that would impact the future of our communities. the project took form in a document, and I actually have it here. If anyone's interested, I can loan this out. It might be doodled on by my kids, but it's there. And so it's basically a document that outlines the Indian residential school system, and it includes personal testimony of the effects and the generational effects of this system. And it included the voices of non-Indigenous people. And in this way, our project kind of was different than the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because we wanted to include non-Indigenous voices that were grappling with defining their role in the dialogue. And the document was circled around the community, and we actually still hope to reformat it and refocus it to make its way into schools. The project was also meant to be kind of a jumping off point for people to aid people and groups in furthering or even beginning an educational journey. And we identified ways or directions people could go further in this process. And I'm going to outline those the last slide of this presentation. So we had a very specific interest in St. Augustine's residential school, which was located in Sechelt, to honor the fact that the history took place right in our own backyard, and also to show how the effects of the history were working today on both individual and collective levels and in various ways throughout our communities. So we felt that these are also pictures at St. Augustine's, and that's a picture outside of St. Augustine's. These are from Google Images. So through reviewing the history of the residential school system at the community level, our truth-telling initiative aimed to illustrate how residential schools were basically an example of how Indigenous peoples and their cultures were and still are being assaulted, displaced, and marginalized as part of a cognizant colonial project. The project aimed to illustrate the effects of residential schools, or how the effects of residential schools are still being played out in communities today, making it mandatory to bring this history to light for the health of our communities and also in the name of justice. When researching and writing this project, countless conversations were held with people who really actually, honestly, didn't know that there was a residential school in Sechelt. And this reality begged the question, how can we expect broad-based reconciliation and community healing to begin if so many community members are uninformed? So specifically, the project included personal stories and reflections from Indigenous people who attended the residential school. They highlighted their experiences and the residual effects of these experiences. And I was extremely we were really fortunate to have people that wanted to share that history, and maybe some people didn't really want to, but they felt they needed to share that history. So there was a range of people interviewed, including one elder, Teresa Jeffries. She was the first person who graduated high school, the first Sechelt person who graduated high school, and she also fought to regain her status after she lost it by marrying a non-native man. It was just a huge honor to spend time with her, and she actually since passed away. So it's extremely special to have her voice in that document, and we're extremely fortunate that she shared her story. So we also included the voice of non-Indigenous individuals who had their own experiences with residential school and who were working to address the legacy of the system. So I'm just going to offer some insights that I gathered through doing this work. And mainly a lot of the insights are going to be around basically settler roles, because that's what I feel I can speak to. This work is obviously ongoing. It's personal, and we felt that it was best done at the local level, although that could be argued either way. I don't want to put a bad face on the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but we just felt that through this process, we felt that this was reconciliation was best done face to face at the community, like local level. So I'll point out that this is a really hard road. There were times where the main facilitator of the project, Wesley Jeffries, we felt that our differences would lead to our distancing. But we were always brought back to the work because of our deep desire to address the issues that kept our communities separate and suspicious of one another. This project was just a beginning. It was the project is actually still underway on the Sunshine Coast, at least I like to believe it is. I'm certain it is. I'm always in regular contact with Wesley, and we have become really close friends through the process. So it's ongoing there, and I moved here to Terrace. I guess I'm going on my 3rd year now. So for me, living in this town, the work is also continuing for me. I have a whole new set of questions and thoughts for like just the example I gave before. I just bought a house on unceded territory, and I never thought I'd do that, but I'm wondering what that means, and I would like to have a discussion around that. Also, I just wanted to point out that the government that has been elected to represent my voice is in treaty negotiations with a nation that's in this region. And as a settler, I think it's important that I guess look into whether or not these negotiations are being done in good faith, because the history of treaty making in this country is typically not a very positive one, and treaties often are always viewed as kind of like Native people's business, but treaties are being made between the government of Canada and the First Nations. So we need to ensure that we're actually holding our governments accountable to the arrangements that were and are currently being made in treaty making time. So I just wanted to also say that like this work never really ends. It kind of continues, and there's questions that pop up in my mind all the time. This work is personal. We saw that this project moved from academic pursuit to a very personal transformation, and this is what I believe that reconciliation looks like. I don't want the preconceived notions of the colonizer and the colonized to inhibit my children from living here in a good way. And I know that Indigenous people are tired of the stereotypes and systemic barriers that are in place in this country. So I just think that there isn't really an objective view when you're doing this work. In order to truly stand in solidarity with Indigenous people, you really need to situate yourself within the discourse and go through a very personal, reflective process. And lastly, like I've said before, through the conversations we had in Sechelt, we found the reoccurring theme that contributors felt healing is more attainable on individual and community level. So I'll just go through some final thoughts here. Indigenous decolonization, it's not really my place to name or direct Indigenous peoples healing, but I guess from the work that I did, I can say that through this project I found that Indigenous peoples are healing in many different ways, unique and personal ways, and many people I spoke with are turning to spirituality and their culture to heal, while other people are looking towards other healing practices. This is also happening collectively, so Sechelt people are supporting each other by coming together to reclaim and redefine their identity and to address various tactics to reaffirm self-determination. The Sechelt government, the Sechelt nation is a self-governing nation, so they're the first in Canada. So they're doing different things to ensure that their culture thrives once again. And throughout the conversations that comprised of this project, we did hear that community cohesiveness is something that the Sechelt nation's trying to strive for. And through this pursuit, there would be powerful healing and strength. So this is the I Don't Know More movement in Sechelt. We can talk about that during question period as well. Yeah, I was there with my son somewhere. We were walking up the street there. So some other insights that I feel more comfortable speaking directly to are the different settler roles. There's definitely certain parts of decolonization process that needs to be closed to outsiders, and I think it's extremely important to respect this. I go to the Longhouse in Sechelt, and I love going there. It's a wonderful place, but there's also times when I don't go to the Longhouse in Sechelt, and I think that's important, and I completely understand the need for some closed door things to happen to regenerate a culture. There are some roles for settlers in doing decolonization work, and there's a lot of work to be done. So if anyone's interested, I think you can always find a place. I do believe there is a responsibility, actually, that rests with settlers, and if we're interested in living in a fair and just manner, we need to raise questions around settler privilege. And I really like this quote from Tayage Alfred, who is a scholar. I've said his name a few times in this presentation. He's a scholar at University of Victoria in Indigenous governance. And he says, "Find your own place and that of your family in the story of North American colonization. This will tell you what you need to do to make amends for that history and point the way to grounding yourself as a true person of place. Ask Indigenous people about the promises that were made by your ancestors and the commitment that allowed for your existence here, and then decide to honor those promises right here and right now in the best way that you can." So, there's a lot of solidarity work. This kind of falls into the solidarity work that when you're working with alongside Indigenous people. So when I do that, basically for this project, it was really important for me not to name or push the direction of the project. I define my role as kind of acting as a secondary support role, and I followed the leadership and the guidance of the Sechelt people that I was working with. I tried to make myself useful in carrying out a vision of the individuals I was working with. And the key question I asked myself to ensure I was doing this was, am I making space for Indigenous voices and visions and goals and strategies, or am I taking space? And that's a really important thing to define. The other role, and I've totally been told this before, just work with your own people. So there's another side to settler roles, and that's just working within our own communities. If I don't know if you can really define like that, here's the settler community and it's not always that cut and dry, but there is a lot of like educational roles that settlers can take up. I like the term to fix the settler problem on this land. That's a Paulette Regan term, and I absolutely love that. I think it's awesome. So we can, from basically talking around the dinner table to taking a more public stance, there's just countless opportunities for dialogue if you look for them. It's in this realm that I think that settlers can take on more of a leadership role, and that's appropriate. So it's important to point out here that it's actually really, really not the job of non-Indigenous people to help or fix Indigenous peoples. Because this would obviously only be recreating the paternalistic attitudes that have been and still are so prevalent in Canada. So one of the most important roles for non-Indigenous people is to get educated, because before reconciliation must come truth. And it's not fair, really, to ask people to reconcile the past if there has been no reassurance that mainstream Canada has in fact learned from the mistakes of the past and is adequately acting to right historic and current wrongdoings. So we're almost at the end of the presentation here. There's a lot of work to be done. Wesley, and along with a lot of the others who experienced residential school, Wesley Jeffries did attend residential school for a long time before he ran away, and he outlined his story in the book. So Wesley kind of expressed that he was really tired of telling his story over and over and over again with no subsequent action to move forward and to deal with the history and its legacy in a real tangible manner. So it seems that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are stuck in a cycle of victimization, guilt, and blame. And so this cycle is actually really just tiresome and unhelpful, really. So whether we can redefine our relationships is up to our communities and individuals to do the hard work that needs to be done. But the question still remains, what does this work look like? And where can we start? So I've offered an example of the Sechelt Truth-Telling Initiative, but this was just one project, and it was really situational. I'm not suggesting that everyone runs out the door today to go to the First Nation and say, oh, let's do a project like this. Like, it took a really long time to build those relationships, and I'm sure there's a lot of you in here that are doing this work already. So there's just like countless forms that this work can take. From this project, we wanted to give people basically like a jumping off point, so if they were just entering into this work. So we thought that people could start by educating themselves, and I just added in here, take a First Nation Studies course here at UNBC, because why not? What an awesome thing. We have courses happening all the time. I think, is Marion Laval the one who offers those courses? Yeah.
No,
so
I don't offer them.
You don't offer them?
The university does, but I'm the Aboriginal Services Coordinator.
Okay, so Marion Laval is the Aboriginal Services Coordinator. And yeah, why not take a course here? They're offered all the time. The other thing you can do is just to encourage other people to join in education. Educating youth was a big one that popped out at us. It's hard to, I think there's an expression like it's hard to bend an old tree, but well, why not start with youth? And for those of us who have children, definitely raising them in a way where they are aware of Indian residential school at a very young age, and they are aware of all the stuff I've been talking about today. Develop a critical lens. I think it's a very important personal process you can do. It's something that I'm always trying to work on, trying to be more developing my critical consciousness, so I don't just take things at face value and just start questioning, right? Get involved with groups and organizations that are taking action. Attend community events. Create your own event or initiative. And start repatriating stolen land. That's the one I threw in at the end because I think that is an important conversation that needs to happen. I've talked a lot about the Indian residential school system, but there's also a problem here that a lot of people are living on stolen land. So there's a website that talks about this. I couldn't find it, but if people are interested, I could poke a little harder and find that website. That's a whole other conversation that can happen. So, like I say, this project was an example of basically a project that aimed to provide tools for people to join in truth-telling that can lead to understanding, healing, meaningful reconciliation, and decolonization. And like I say, it's just one of countless forms. It was very place-based and situational, but this is just one example of decolonization and reconciliation work. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by this discussion, I would encourage you just to pick up a book to start out. These are some ones that I just kind of thought of off the top of my head. I talked a lot about Paulette Reagan's work, Unsettling the Settler Within. This is Diage Alfred, the second one there, Diage's Wasaze. And I thought I should put up Antonia Mills. She's a UNBC scholar. Eagle Down is Our Law. It's a good book, and the last one there is Lighting the Eighth Fire. And there's a whole bunch of books. I'm sure a lot of you guys know. You could throw out other suggestions. Like I know John Rosenthal just wrote a book, The Comeback, that's just out. I haven't read it, but there's a lot of books out there, so start by picking up a book. And that's the end. Are there any questions, I guess? I'm gonna, as I answer questions, I'm just gonna probably like repeat the question back so that the people, if there is anyone on live stream, I don't know if they are, but then they can hear it so they'll know what we're talking about.
Maybe before we start questions, please join me in thanking Roz for her presentation today. We do have 5 to 10 minutes for questions, but I should also point out that Marion has organized a discussion circle to follow this for people who wish to stay beyond the hour and explore these issues in a little more depth, and I hope Roz will be able to stay as well and engage in a little bit more longer dialogue. I'm afraid I have to leave. But because I have to slip out, I will give you your UNBC gift now.
Oh, wow, thank you.
Since you're so good at promoting our programs as well, we are in fact trying to launch a regional Bachelor of Arts in First Nation Studies with the Quesnel campus. So we hope to have many more courses in this area.
Good.
So thanks,
Thank you.
Rose.
Thank you so much.
Questions?
Could we give you our email address so you can give us a copy of that book, or are you,
Yeah.
can you make copies?
Yeah, for sure. I can make copies and I can do that for sure.
I saw a hand in the back there.
Way at the back, Nikki, yeah.
Just wondering, with your project in Sechelt, what was the physical form that it took on, like the consultation process? What was it? Multiple meetings with
Yeah, okay.
groups, and like I'm just wondering how it physically manifested.
Okay, so the question is what the physical form of the work in Sechelt. So I mentioned in the presentation that we did interviews, so there were like set interviews, but they were like semi-structured and very much like we basically just opened the discussion up. So we interviewed 4 First Nations people, 2 that had attended residential school and 2 that were speaking more to the generational effects of residential school. And then we also interviewed 4 non-Indigenous people, a United Church minister who was obviously like really in depth in reconciliation work, and then an educator and 2 other people who were just kind of viewed as community leaders, and they're people who were very close to the Sechelt First Nation. So that was kind of the interview part of it, but it took a long time to get to that part. Basically, I met with Wesley and I did a whole bunch of like cultural awareness workshops, and there was Wesley did the cultural awareness workshops. I attended them, and then we did church circles, so a whole bunch of circles discussing reconciliation, and we also met like just one-on-one with individuals, and all of that stuff we were doing was informing what was to become the it's basically like a book, and so yeah, so the majority of this book is the interviews, and I like went through and transcribed them, and the first part basically introduces the topic of residential schools. It goes over it very broadly, and then it moves into very specific information about the Sechelt residential school, and then it has the interviews, and then it kind of offers a closing dialogue on directions, and we wanted to offer like insights for people that want to move further in this. So I kind of think that it's a little bit unfinished, like I want to go back and revisit it, but it's a matter of time, and yeah, probably going back, doing a few trips to the Sunshine Coast. So yeah, the tools that we used were to get to that point were basically circles, interviews, like cultural workshops, and a whole bunch of others. So it's a big process. Is there another question? Sure.
I wrote down, ask what the promises made by your ancestors, the commitment that allowed for your existence here, and then decide to honor these promises. I'm wondering if you can give a practical example of somebody doing that.
Okay, so the question is based from the guidance that Diage Alfred offers. He says, like, basically ask about what promises were made and figure out what you want to do from that point on to honor those promises. I think an example of that would be this work. I think that another example of that would be to just, the biggest thing that we distilled was to educate yourself. So something that I'm wondering, and it's kind of embarrassing, I've lived here for 3 years, but I haven't done much work into learning about the residential schools that were operating in this area. So it's really just propelling yourself on an educational journey. So maybe going and talking to people, maybe reading a book about this area and gaining some knowledge about the history of colonization in this specific place. And seeing, like, I don't know, I can't really like tell you exactly what to do. That's kind of a process that you have to figure out by yourself. That's like the beauty of the nature of this work, is that there's no like definition, and there's no like 10-step program to decolonization, but it's about figuring it out for yourself. So the work that, for me personally, I did a master's, but not everyone can do that. But there's like tons of stuff that you can do if you just start the educational journey. I don't know if that answers your question. Did that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there are any big examples that you can think of what people have done in the past. Because, I mean, the
Okay.
promises that were made were pretty significant, and
Yeah, for
you
sure.
follow through on them.
Right.
So
what can be done? Yeah, I think
it's kind of an inequality about the size of the promises and
of
the
course.
little things. You know.
I think the Idle No More movement was an excellent movement that settlers have been standing in solidarity with Indigenous people, helping support that movement. And so I hope that movement continues. I think it sure got off to a great start. And so following up on that stuff, and like I said at the end, I kind of snuck in a little note on like repatriating stolen land, and that seems that a lot of times people are just like, oh, this is what our country looks like, and we don't have the imagination to think about what it could be. And of course, yeah, there's been huge promises that have been broken. So there needs to be a discussion around that, and there is a discussion around that, and I think we could do a better job of imagining what we could do.
I've been reading a little bit about the history of terrorists from like early 1900s, just beforehand, and they do touch on colonization, obviously, and the land here. My question is the repatriation in Sechelt, what are they doing down there to give back?
Mhm.
Or is there anything being done at this point? And that's my question, because I'm trying to figure out how that would look here. Like,
Yeah, it's a huge question, and I'm probably not the best person to answer it, but I can say that Sechelt's pretty unique in that they attained self-government in 1986, and so they are technically like a self-governing nation, which is pretty cool. And I think that they're just realizing the extent, like it hasn't really been offered. I mean, the government of Canada hasn't done a lot of those self-governing things, because it does give them a lot of power that's actually just being recognized right now. So, but in terms of land repatriation, I think unfortunately a lot of people think of treaty making when we talk about land repatriation, and Sechelt Nation actually stepped out of the treaty process because they felt that it was they were getting, I think the number was like, if you looked at their historical, or not historical, if you looked at their territory and you saw what was being offered in treaty, it was like 0.1% of the traditional territory. So I think that I've heard numbers of that. When people think about repatriating stolen land, you think, oh, like I bought my house and you can't have my land, I live here, and people get their backs up a lot around that. But I've heard statistics, I don't know if it's absolutely accurate, but I think like 90% of the land in British Columbia is crown land. So like we could not even touch like private fee simple land and repatriate a lot of land. So Sechelt specifically, I know that they were starting to talk treaties again, and I know they're doing treaty talks in Kitselis, and it's not my place to say whether that's right or wrong, but I think there needs to be a lot of questions about what are we talking about here, and it's certainly something that should be discussed.
Perhaps that's a good place to stop and dissolve into a larger discussion.
I'm Arlene Roberts.
Hi, Eileen?
Arlene.
Arlene.
Yeah.
Okay,
My
Arlene
husband is
Roberts.
Don Roberts.
Okay.
He's chief counselor for Kids and Calum, and
Oh.
like on his behalf to welcome you to Kids and Calum territory.
Thank you.
And so I'm also with the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, and I brought some pamphlets and some business cards, and I'd like to thank you for inviting our office here. Otherwise, we would have never known this was happening.
Great.
You can email us. We do workshops on the history of residential school, understanding our culture, what post-trauma is. We do them individually as well as groups. And First Nations and non-First Nations. Our office covers the whole Northwest, which is from Haida Gwaii to this side of Prince George, up to Atwood and down or over to Kitimat. That is our territory. So, and we always have a big mix, and I really like your resources, especially the Eighth Fire. It's excellent. People can actually see that on the web, so he's really good. The presenter is excellent. So the other thing too, I think by understanding, well, a couple of things here. One, I don't know if anybody is familiar with the Terra Standard Facebook page. And yesterday there was a gentleman, a local gentleman here. Well, I don't even want to call him a gentleman. He was saying things like there's nothing, the First Nations that just get money from the government all the time and do nothing with it. And I'm tired of giving them millions of dollars. And there's the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And this guy's in his 70s and he's a local. He's very active here in Terra, so we're really super disappointed to see that on Facebook. It's going viral right now. Terra Standard finally took that off of their Facebook after a lot of us complained. So what does that tell you?
Right, we've gone nowhere.
Yeah.
Really very little.
Yeah. And so the other thing too is when you look at the broken promises, I think a really good example of understanding the broken promises is by looking at what Harper has done with the veterans. With that, when you look at what had happened, the closing of the offices, all the broken promises with medical and all these other stuff, that'll bring it a little closer to home of understanding the depth that where we're at as First Nations people. If you take a look at what's all happened with that. So if you need some sort of guidance, I think that would be a really good idea to take a look at the veteran stuff. And then the other thing is, I have a dance group with Terrace District, and they're First Nations and non-First Nations that come and dance and sing with us, and they're all special needs. So, and I did this presentation on the history of residential school, and it's a kid version, right? Anyway, I did it in high school a few years ago. And I brought all these masks and all this regalia and these drums and everything, and the kids were so hungry for it. It It was amazing. There was like 60 kids, and they were all really into wanting to touch regalia and the drums and the rattles and the masks, and I'm like, put them on, you know. And the majority of the kids that were there were non-First Nations, and they were so happy to actually touch it, you know, and be a part of that, be a part of the culture, to actually to physically hold it in their hands. And so then, what does that tell you there? What happens after they graduate, right? I mean, what's going on? What goes on afterwards? Because when I see that at a high school level, and the kids are so open and honest, and there's no fear. There's still no fear there with that. So, and just to be sharing in that beauty of our culture was just a wonderful experience. That gave me hope, right? That gave me lots of hope. And I think that's the type of experiences that I'd like to share with people. So here's our business cards, and here's our pamphlets. And if you have any workshops, if you don't have them, we'll create it for you. So,
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arlene. I hope you'll be able to stick around for a little bit for the discussion after this as well, too. I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Mary.